Thank you so much for attending this SOF Health Deep Dive. I'm Lindsay Snook, the Operations Director at Military Special Operations Family Collaborative, which is a nonprofit public health initiative for the special operations community. I'm pleased to see so many familiar names and faces joining us tonight, and a special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. This Health Deep Dive is a follow-on event from our March SOF Team Room, which is a quarterly virtual event that we co-host with the Global SOF Foundation to start community conversations on hot topics and get practical health resources into our community. In March, we talked about relationships, family building, outdoor adventuring as a couple, and the deliberate discomfort challenge. And we also had a teaser health sprint on the role of community in psychedelic medicine. And the SOF Team Room starts the conversation, but tonight we'll be devoting the full 2 hours to this one important topic. We'll start the evening off discussing the state of the research on psychedelic-assisted therapy, what's approved, and potential timelines for approval for different groups within our community. Then we'll move into what questions SOF veterans and families should be asking when seeking treatment to make sure it's right for their needs. Finally, we'll talk about how to navigate the intersection of community, traditional and ceremonial usage, and Western implementation of more clinical psychedelic-assisted therapies. If you submitted a question ahead of time, we've worked hard to weave that into the outline of tonight's discussion, but we'll also have time for new questions during the Q&A sessions. Kaylee Lehman, the MSOFC Executive Director, is in the chat and can pass along your questions to our presenters, or you can raise your virtual hand to ask your question live. You'll notice that this session is being recorded. You're welcome to keep your camera off to avoid being recorded if you prefer. This is an important topic to many in our community, and the recording will serve as a resource available after the event is over. So please be on the lookout for the blog post and follow-up email and share it widely. You'll also notice a couple of anonymous poll questions pop up throughout the event to help us get to know our audience and your needs, such as the one that I am launching right now. There we go. And that's all about your connection to the SOF community. And then this will just help us to get to know you, and some other questions will pop up throughout the evening. Now, without further delay, I'm honored to introduce our expert panel tonight. Dr. Aaron Wolfgang is an Army psychiatrist at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and also currently serves as the Novel and Emerging Therapeutics Deputy Psychiatry Consultant to the Office of the Army Surgeon General. His past 3 years of research work have focused on clarifying the legal, ethical, clinical, operational, and systems considerations for safely offering psychedelic-assisted therapies to active duty service members. Welcome, Dr. Wolfgang. Dr. Chantel Ferland-Beckham is a translational neuroscientist and the Senior Director of External Affairs at Cohen Veterans Bioscience. She's experienced in neuropsychiatry, addiction, brain injury, PTSD, and suicide prevention. Thank you for being here, Dr. Ferland-Beckham. Dr. Sharman Ghaznavi is the Associate Director of the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she conducts research to understand how psychedelics enhance the brain's capacity for change, to optimize current treatments, and to create new treatments for mental illness. Welcome, Dr. Ghaznavi. Christine Ray Olmsted is a psychiatric epidemiologist at RTI International, specializing in evaluations of novel treatments for PTSD in service members, such as stellate ganglion block and psychedelic medicine. Christine, thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight. And finally, we have Jesse Gould, who was our Health Sprint speaker at the SOF Team Room in March. Jesse is a veteran Army Ranger and the founder and president of Heroic Hearts Project, connecting veterans to psychedelic treatments. Thank you for joining us once again, Jesse. Now, Dr. Wolfgang, please kick us off with the state of the research and what is known about the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Absolutely. And before I get started, I really just want to express my gratitude, especially to Lindsay and Kaylee for organizing this and coordinating this. There's a lot that they both put behind the scenes to make this happen. So really just want to express my gratitude to you both. Thank you. With that, share my slides.
Sorry, I'm just going ahead and sharing the results of that poll here so that everybody can see. We have a ton of veterans in the audience. We have a lot of healthcare providers, spouses, wonderful to see you. And thank you so much to our community supporters who are here tonight as well.
All right, is everyone seeing the full screen here? All right. So just going to be giving a brief overview of psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies. Here's a disclaimer: these views expressed in this presentation are my own and don't reflect the official policy position of any element in the DoD. Just a brief outline. Going to be, for the next maybe 5 to 10 minutes, going to be talking specifically about the landscape and status of the research currently. And so before getting into that, really wanted to get into identifying the different psychedelics that are out there and not only lumping the ways in which they're the same, but also differentiating them from each other. So we have phenethylamines, tryptamines, dissociatives. We have various different neurotransmitters and different medications that are in this class of phenethylamines. The same goes for tryptamines, such as melatonin. And we also have dissociatives such as ketamine, dextromethorphan, nitrous oxide, which are medications that are dissociatives. In terms of phenethylamines, we also have MDMA, which is also known as an entactogen or an empathogen. Entactogen meaning to touch within, and empathogen meaning to generate empathy. There's also mescaline, which is from the peyote cactus. Then in tryptamines, we also have LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, or DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And we also have 5-MeO, dimethyltryptamine, or ibogaine, and several other medications or several other substances that are known as tryptamines. And you also have ketamine, which is also known as a dissociative, as well as PCP. And then we have what's known as the classical psychedelics, which are LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline. And then we have what are known as, colloquially known as non-classical psychedelics, which are the ones that you see here. And then there's the idea of what is a psychedelic? What's the definition of a psychedelic? And so the psychedelic itself means mind manifesting, but depending on what studies you're looking at, what papers you're reading, or who you're talking to, the word psychedelic can mean different things. And so for some, there's the strict definition of that, which strictly constitutes just the classical psychedelics you see here. Other folks might use the broad definition, which encompasses both classical and all non-classical psychedelics, to include the entactogens and dissociatives. Another common definition, this would be the more common definition used these days, which excludes ketamine, which is dissociative, but does include MDMA and the classical psychedelics and some other non-classical psychedelics. Another definition includes, of course, the classical psychedelics, some non-classical psychedelics like 5-MeO, as well as ibogaine, excludes MDMA. And the idea being that, as we'll see in the next slides, that MDMA, the subjective effects of MDMA and many other entactogens are quite different from what we know as the classical psychedelics and other psychedelics. And so I would say these last two are probably the two most common definitions that you'll see. In terms of the safety of different substances, so we don't have all the psychedelics here, just a handful of psychedelics compared to other compounds. And so this is a study that was published in The Lancet several years ago, and it looked at dependence versus physical harm of several different substances. You see here, we have heroin, cocaine, barbiturates, and other substances graphed in terms of physical harm and dependence. But you also see in the bottom, towards the bottom left, are MDMA and LSD, which, as you see here, have relatively low potential for physical harm and dependence. So overall, the point here being that psychedelics have a low risk of dependence and harm. Another common question, or another common kind of assumption that folks come in with, is that psychedelics get lumped in conceptually with each other in terms of their subjective effects. Are they all really the same? And the point being here, different compounds and different psychedelics actually have a wide range of subjective effects and that differ quite starkly. And so here is one of the best studies, most well-designed studies conducted to date that compare different psychedelics. And so various individuals that were healthy participants received these different compounds spaced by about a week or two apart. As you see here, that ultimately along these different subjective effects, you had LSD quite high, or relatively high in terms of the subjective effects, whereas MDMA was actually a lot closer in its subjective effects to D-amphetamine, which is a cousin of Adderall. And so when you look at spiritual experience, blissful state, evolution, or the dissolving of the sense of self, anxiety, embodiment, kind of you're separating from your body, impairments in control and cognition, imagery, both in complex and elementary imagery, synesthesia in terms of hearing colors and perhaps tasting sounds and that kind of thing, that compared to LSD, MDMA was a lot closer to the cousin of Adderall and placebo was to LSD. And even though this study only looked at these four arms, you can imagine how different psychedelics might be somewhere in between MDMA and LSD. And so the point here being that the subjective effects of MDMA in particular don't equate to other psychedelics. And especially with MDMA, cognitive and perceptual lucidity do remain intact. And so definitely want to preface by saying this is certainly a busy slide, and so apologize up front for that, but really want to take folks through the landscape of what the evidence currently says in terms of these different compounds, starting with ketamine at the very top, which was FDA approved back in 1970 for analgesia or for pain. And just several years ago, as ketamine, a cousin of ketamine, was FDA approved for depression. Then you have MDMA, so they just finished their last phase 3 clinical trial just several months ago, and it's currently being submitted for publication. And there's actually no more phase 3 or any clinical trials at all that are going to need to be done between now and potential FDA approval, which is projected for June of next year. And those studies have been done in PTSD. You also have psilocybin, which might be FDA approved perhaps about 2 years from then, and particularly for depression. Then you have the other psychedelics like LSD, DMT, ibogaine 5-MeO, DMT, which are which are, in terms of their projected FDA approval, a lot further down the timeline, at least 2030, if not further than that. So just to zoom in a little bit more on ketamine, or in terms of what these different check marks mean. So the green check marks mean that the strongest data right now is positive, and the red check marks essentially mean that the strongest RCT or randomized controlled trial data is null. And the dash means that there's no RCT data currently. So for ketamine, best study for PTSD was actually null at this point, whereas for depression, it seems to have some decent evidence for depression as well as for suicidality and pain, for which it's FDA approved. The VA DoD clinical practice guidelines actually recommend ketamine for both depression and suicidality. And those were clinical practice guidelines for 2002 and 2019, effectively. Ketamine, the best evidence right now is for depression. MDMA, again, best evidence right now is for PTSD. There's also evidence for depression as well. Psilocybin, currently the best evidence is for depression, but there's a meta-analysis that showed that perhaps it actually also helps with suicidality as well. And there's also some data for pain, and there's also RCT evidence for LSD as well. But clinical trials currently are primarily being done in terms of LSD for generalized anxiety disorder. And then you also have the other psychedelics that you see here, DMT, ibogaine 5-MeO, which are a lot less further along. There's plenty of uncontrolled data or unrandomized, either unrandomized clinical trials, open label clinical trials that are not randomized, that show promising data, and a lot of observational studies that show promising data, either for PTSD, TBI, depression, alcohol use, substance use. So there's each of these substances truly could be a whole 2-hour discussion in and of itself, but just suffice to say that there's a lot of promising earlier data for each of these compounds right now. And so there's still a lot to be seen, essentially. And also, just because I certainly get a lot of questions on cannabinoids, so really just want to touch on that briefly. And so the best evidence right now, at least for military personnel and veterans, when it comes to cannabinoids, is actually found that the evidence is really null when it comes to both PTSD and pain. And so the long story short here is that, and for both clinical trials of PTSD and pain in military personnel or veterans for cannabinoids, found that folks actually do improve in their PTSD symptoms and pain, but the kicker is that so do the placebo groups. And even more so that in the placebo groups and the active groups actually had improvements that are even greater than, in effect, than some of our best first-line treatments for PTSD right now. So the point being there that it seems like cannabinoids, there's a potential expectancy bias or another placebo effect that better explains why cannabinoids seem to potentially help folks in terms of their reports of PTSD and pain symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually improve PTSD or pain symptoms. So right now, it seems like the placebo effect is the best explanation for why some people report improvements when it comes to cannabinoids and PTSD and pain. So the current political landscape when it comes to psychedelics is that MDMA assisted therapy and expanded access or compassionate use has now been initiated about half a year ago. And so that is essentially, instead of a research setting, this is in a treatment setting where folks are now able to go to certain select places in the United States to get treatment for MDMA-assisted therapy. The issue is that the wait long right now is that access is a huge problem. And but additional treatment centers are currently being planned to open. So there's at least 7 VA medical centers that are either conducting or planning to conduct MDMA-assisted therapy clinical trials currently. The White House hasn't said anything about psychedelics specifically, but what they have said is that the Biden-Harris administration strongly supports expanding the research of Schedule I substances, broadly speaking. In Texas, they recently passed a bill to study psychedelic-assisted therapy in veterans, particularly psilocybin. Both Rick Perry, who's the Republican former governor of Texas, as well as state Democrats, came together, in addition to several Navy SEAL veterans, to support this bill. In Maryland passed a bill recently to authorize $1 million for research funding, not only for Walter Reed, but also for other civilian Maryland academic centers to study psychedelics. And the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, there was 2 amendments that passed the House, but not the Senate, to study psychedelics, specifically in active duty service members. But again, those amendments did not pass the Senate and were not signed into law. And those were supported by Representative Dan Crenshaw, as well as Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, respectively. So another common question are related to legal considerations at the intersection of the DoD and psychedelic-assisted therapies. And so currently there are no insurmountable legal barriers, and this is verified by legal review from Medical Research Development Command, JAG. And essentially, there is a legal pathway to conduct Schedule I research in the DoD. And Schedule I substances administered in the context of an FDA and command-approved participation in a clinical trial or a treatment setting does constitute being a legal prescription. And there's a lot of caveats there. And so it would not be wrongful, illegal, or improper for active duty or National Guard or Reserve again, to receive these legal prescriptions as long as it's in a setting that's approved by the FDA as well as command. By command, meaning the individual service member's command. Participation in a civilian clinical trial must not be supported by DoD resources. So the individual can be on leave or PTDY unless the clinical trial is approved through proper DoD channels, according to AR 40-7. Schedule 1 substances legally administered in an appropriate setting would not affect security clearances. And UAs or urine drug screens are not a concern as long as the service member, their command, and the medical review officer all adhere to regulations. And so they're not going to get into the details and nuances of that. But there is, but because it's a legal prescription, as long as all stakeholders adhere to regulations, the UA would not be an issue. And here, just really want to provide a broad overview of what a treatment course might look like. And so for MDMA-assisted therapy, folks typically get 2 to 3 medication sessions, each of which are about 6 to 8 hours long, about 1 month apart. When it comes to psilocybin-assisted therapy, folks will get a dose either once or twice, about a month apart. And then when it comes to other more potent psychedelics, then folks might only get the psychedelic a single time in clinical trials currently. So before the first medication session, there will be several preparatory sessions, each of which are about 90 minutes long. And the idea there is to help build rapport between the patient as well as the co-therapist, because typically there's 2 therapists, but some clinical trials have been using a single therapist. So the intent of these prep sessions is to build rapport, to help educate the patient about what to expect in terms of the treatment, as well as for the therapist to answer any of the patient's questions. And then often the first integration session, an integration session essentially being a supportive psychotherapy session to help make sense of the experiences that the individual had during a medication session. The first integration session often will be in the morning after first medication or each medication session, as well as depending on the design of the clinical trial, there will be additional integration sessions interspersed between medication sessions. And so just to get a sense of what treatment can look like. So this is what the treatment setting looked like in the clinical I was involved in when I was involved in a psilocybin therapy clinical trial at Yale. And so essentially we had to repurpose someone's office, unfortunately, but we repurposed the office, kind of set it up to be as comfortable as we could for the patient. You also have blood pressure monitors and to be able to monitor vitals, and as you see here, we have 2 chairs for the therapist as well. And then here's some more images from different either clinical trials or treatment settings, actually all clinical trials, showing what a treatment can look like in various settings. And so again, we have 2 co-therapists, mostly here in the top right, a single therapist, with the second likely being in a monitoring room. And you also see, vital monitoring in the top left image there. In most of these images, you see the patient wearing an eye mask. And the idea of the eye mask is to turn the individual's attention inwards, because, for example, MDMA is one of the most commonly used substances in recreational settings. And you can imagine how a portion of those individuals might have PTSD. And the question is, why aren't the individuals magically cured of their PTSD? The point being, in a recreational setting, it's a very external experience. Whereas when it comes to therapy and psychedelic-assisted therapy, the idea is to turn your attention inwards. And certainly can be able to speak at length about that, but I think that's enough of an overview at this point in terms of the idea of the eye shades. You also see headphones and the idea of the headphones is to play music for the patient, that this is a pre-curated playlist of music to help set the setting and the mindset of the individual in a therapy to be set in a therapeutic mindset ultimately. And yeah, from there, we'll shift towards the idea of there being a paradigm shift from the idea of chronic medications to the paradigm of medication-assisted therapy. And so, although we're talking about psychedelic therapy, really, in my mind, the idea is that it's more about medication-assisted therapy, where with chronic medications, in the classic paradigm of chronic medications, the cause of behavioral health conditions is rooted in a neurobiologic imbalance, and medications have to be administered chronically to offset that balance. Whereas the emerging paradigm with the medication-assisted therapy is that the cause of behavioral health conditions is rooted in cognitions, emotions, and behaviors, and the role in the medication taken infrequently, as we saw, just 1 to 3 times total, and only in a supervised medical setting, analogous to surgical anesthesia, is in the role of that medication is actually to enhance the therapy, where the idea is the therapy, not the medication, is the most important aspect of the treatment. The role of the medication is to enhance the therapy. And whether that's psychedelics, and there's also a recent study that came out with stellate ganglion block out of Strong Star and Utesca, showing that masked PE, masked prolonged exposure along with stellate ganglion block also had high rates of remission in terms of their PTSD. So even that falls into this paradigm of medication-assisted therapy, where the therapy is the most important aspect of the treatment. And the medication is only there to enhance the therapy. Another kind of frame shift for people I think is super important is the idea that psychedelic-assisted therapy is akin to surgery in many ways. So there's the idea of knife versus scalpel, where the knife in the wrong hands and context, there's a high risk for harm for everyone involved. Whereas scalpel in the right hands, in the right context, there's a potential for dramatic clinical benefit, even when everything else has failed. Another way to look at this is the analogy of orthopedic surgery for a musculoskeletal injury versus psychedelic therapy for a behavioral health condition, where for a musculoskeletal condition, you have ibuprofen to treat symptoms up front, you have physical therapy to try to get at an underlying cause of the injury. And after 4 to 6 weeks, if that's not enough, that's when you lean on orthopedic surgery to open up the wound, to really get in there and address the issue. And the same idea with when it comes to behavioral health. Right now, we have antidepressants, which do help with symptoms. We have psychotherapy, which do attempt to get at underlying causes of the issue. But sometimes even that just simply isn't enough. And that's where psychedelic-assisted therapy comes in terms of being that last line of defense. And so again, just some other analogies where surgery is often the last, not the first line of defense. Both surgery as well as psychedelic therapy have a higher cost, they're resource intensive, require additional logistical and structural support. And you have to optimize access to, you can't give everyone orthopedic surgery, just the same way you can't give everyone psychedelic therapy. Folks really have to go through those first line treatments first. And hopefully that's enough for the individual. But for the 2/3 of folks, or the 1/2 of folks where our best treatments right now, best first line treatments right now for PTSD just aren't enough, that's where we need surgery. That's where in my mind, psychedelic therapy comes in, or medication-assisted therapy. And just like surgery with PAT, there's an open question. Is there a potential for service members to return to duty instead of being medically discharged? And this is a huge question that we have to answer through research. So in summary, let's not cognitively lump psychedelics together. Instead, we have to look at the evidence for each individually. Subjective effects vary between the compounds. Psychedelics are safe and efficacious for a wide range of conditions. MDMA-assisted therapy is projected to be FDA approved June of next year. Psilocybin-assisted therapy projected to be FDA approved about 2 years after. These treatments are promising, but more research is needed. The political climate is increasingly favorable, and Schedule I clinical research in active duty service members is legal in the DoD. With that, I'll turn the baton over.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a very thorough state of the research. And I'm sure we've surprised some folks in there with some of the legality information that you have been working hard on finding out. And now that doesn't mean that anybody can just rush to their doctor and ask for this therapy, but definitely it's good to know that the clinical trials are available and legal out there. So we'll, I believe that we have Dr. Ghaznavi up next to discuss a little bit more about research. Oh, excuse me, Dr. Furlan-Beckham.
There we go. So I'm going to try hard not to overlap with Dr. Wilking in my talk, but there might be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully I can kind of weave through where I need to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, kind of the who, what, and why this potential new tool and why we need to expand the research even more. So I don't think there's any question about mental health being an issue for veterans and active duty. Often this is a bigger impediment to daily life than physical health. The prevalence of many of the conditions that psychedelics are being explored for is pretty significantly high among active duty and veterans. Estimates of 10 to 20% for post-traumatic stress disorder, 50% for depression, 19% for traumatic brain injury, particularly the chronic traumatic brain injury that we see long-term effects from. And right now, 30% of active duty and veterans have a mental health condition that requires treatment, but less than 50% are actually receiving any mental health treatment. And of those, a very large percentage are not receiving a mental health treatment that's essentially working for them. So, the question is, why is that? But we all know that suicide is a significant cost of the invisible wounds. The numbers are kind of all over the place in terms of agreement, but I think 22 a day is kind of the most accepted number that we have. And the most startling figure, I think, to me, is that the number of suicides post 9/11 is drastically higher than the number of deaths in theater. And mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder and TBI significantly increase the likelihood of somebody taking their life by suicide. So kind of what has happened from a scientific perspective with the invisible wounds. So for far too long, we've sort of thought about all of these conditions as a single diagnosis. So I was diagnosed with PTSD 20 years ago. The way that we diagnose PTSD is exactly the same now as it's sort of always been, despite the fact that we pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the research on these conditions. We think of them as a single disorder. And so because of that, you're essentially lumped all together with everybody with the same diagnosis and given one set of treatment playbook that patients are put under. But the more that we do research into these conditions, the more we understand that there's a lot of nuance to how these conditions are. And it's really probably not the most accurate to put them all together as a single diagnosis. In fact, for PTSD, there are over 630,000 symptom combinations that can get you to a PTSD diagnosis. So we need to sort of rethink how we think about these conditions and think about them more like we do with cancer. We don't diagnose people with cancer, we diagnose people with very specific, detailed versions of what cancer is, and people get a very individualized treatment plan based on what their cancer is. And so, what the research is starting to show is that if we could really look at everybody who has a diagnosis of PTSD and we look at their genetics, we look at neuroimaging, we look at their immune system, we look at their overall physiology, their metabolism, and we take all of that information, we can likely start to cluster patients into different groups based on their unique biology. And so from that, the goal would be that we would then start to treat people with a treatment suite that includes a very holistic approach to treating patients that focuses on things like sleep and nutrition, things like exercise, things like medication, and a number of different other treatment options. And psychedelics are just one of the tools that we hope will be able to be incorporated within this treatment toolbox. So the research, as mentioned, shows a lot of promise, but we really just don't have enough data right now to be able to understand what are the right patients for psychedelic-assisted therapy. This requires a lot more data than we have. In October of last year, at the behest of our organization and a coalition of other groups that we work with, we essentially asked the VA to do a state of the science. So what is going on in psychedelics therapy? And overwhelmingly, their conclusion was that the data is very promising, but their confidence is really low in the data. And that's mainly because the number of trials, clinical trials, sort of legitimate trials that are on the pathway to getting a compound through the FDA regulatory pathway is really small, and the number of patients in each trial is really small. And there are a lot of things that we just don't understand about the research that we have, the whole body of research. So are these treatments long lasting? Are they going to work consistently across different populations, different patient populations? Are the risk of stopping kind of the current medications a patient might be on, do those outweigh any benefits of actually undergoing psychedelic-assisted therapy? You know, as Erin kind of showed, you know, this is a very complex treatment process. Are the treatment protocols really scalable in everyday practice? Like, we have a shortage of mental health providers currently. Are we actually able to scale these treatments at the level that would really increase the access for everybody? But the resurgence is definitely there in clinical research. The increase in research participation in the last 5 years has gone up quite significantly. The number of publications, so people kind of writing about this and publishing their findings, has very exponentially increased in the last 10 years. There's no shortage of kind of talking about it in the media and, you know, people kind of like word of mouth talking about, you know, the potential for these, this renaissance of treatment in mental health. And, you know, there's a large resurgence of an actual number of clinical trials that are underway right now. But the caveat being that as of 2021, only 315 patients had sort of taken part in the types of clinical trials that will lead to FDA approval. And that number only increased by another 300 patients in the last year, and mainly based on some of the studies that are kind of at the head of the game from organizations like MAPS. So the conclusion is kind of more research is needed. There are a lot of challenges to doing clinical research in psychedelics. A lot of people talk about the set and setting issues. Those kind of refer to the fact that if you're participating in a clinical trial, unlike in normal clinical trials where you wouldn't know whether or not you're in the treatment group or the placebo or non-treatment group, in psychedelic clinical trials, there's kind of no way to do that. There's no way to blind you to what treatment you're in. Some of the studies have looked at using like a low dose treatment, but there's a lot of challenges with that. But overwhelmingly, when people are participating in a clinical trial with psychedelics, if you ask them afterwards, do you know what treatment arm you were in, whether you were getting psychedelics or not? They overwhelmingly know which one. And that's kind of an issue when it comes to getting FDA approval for these clinical trials. This is sort of a traditional thing that you would expect. There's also kind of the problem of sort of teasing out whether or not it's the psychedelic compounds that are creating the benefit or it's the psychotherapy itself. The reason this is sort of an issue is because the FDA does not approve or have any control over the approval of psychotherapy. They only have the approval over things like medication. And so, there's going to be some questions when this FDA pathway comes down for some of the compounds that are in clinical trials right now, and how the FDA is going to essentially deal with that. There's also sort of the clinical role of what the hallucinogenic component of these compounds, like how does that actually work in terms of how the compounds work and whether they're effective. There are a number of companies that are out there that are working to try to develop compounds that sort of mimic the mechanism of action of how the drug actually works in your brain without sort of having the hallucinogenic component. And so, there's a lot in the pathway as to try to figure out if you can tease those two components out. And those are going to be, challenges in the clinical research space as we go. There's also problems of studying representative populations. So, many patients, for example, who have intractable PTSD are on drugs that also have a similar way of working within the brain. So things that work on the serotonin system. And so it's kind of a challenge when you think about many of these patients are already on serotonin drugs. You have to back them off of those drugs in order to put them into the psychedelic clinical trials, and kind of what that does to the patient in that process. But by and large, there are a number of companies who have heavily invested in this space. There's over 45 companies with some compound in some level of the clinical trial process. The clinical trial process is generally very long. It takes on average about 10 years to get a drug from the early stages through to FDA approval. And there are companies at all levels of this process. And a lot really sort of in the pipeline, but largely in the private and public space. The ones that most people are really well aware of are MAPS, who are studying the use of MDMA for PTSD. Their phase 3 trial is finished at this point, and as Erin said, they're in the process of actually submitting for FDA approval for this very specific condition under very specific treatment protocol. And then Compass is the other one who's looking at treatment-resistant depression for using psilocybin. And then there's another group that's looking at alcohol use disorder with ketamine. But again, as mentioned, these compounds are being widely explored for a number of different conditions, from bipolar to generalized anxiety disorders, to eating disorders, opioid withdrawal, postpartum depression. It sort of runs the gambit. There is some research at the National Institutes of Health. This is by and large on the very early stage of research. So think, animal models, looking at how these drugs actually work in the brain, things like that. Only one clinical trial is listed as of right now as being active in recruiting, and that's for looking at the use of psilocybin in tobacco use disorder. So there's a pretty big gap in terms of funding at the National Institutes of Health. And then at the VA, there are a number of studies underway or in the process of recruiting. But again, it's really important to understand these numbers for target enrollment are incredibly small. Not really enough to sort of draw meaningful conclusions as to whether or not these compounds are going to work under these different indications. And none of the studies right now that are being conducted at the VA are actually being funded by the VA. So there's a huge gap in which the VA could really kind of step up and take a leadership role to fund more research into these compounds to get them to the approval process faster. So that's all for me. I'm gonna stop sharing and pass over to Sharman.
Sorry, had a few technical issues there. Something else kept popping up. All right, so I just wanted to actually go into a couple of the major trials to date to show what the data actually looks like. And I think it's important to see that because we see a lot in the headlines about positive results for this and so on, but it can be really helpful to see, how positive is it? Who is it helping? And as Chantal mentioned, a lot of these numbers are pretty small. And so that's something to really bear in mind. So the first of these is, I wanted to look at what is the largest study of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for depression. And this is the COMPASS phase 2B trial that Chantal referred to. And in this, Goodman and colleagues conducted a randomized controlled double-blind phase 2B trial, a single dose of psilocybin with psychological support in 233 patients with treatment-resistant depression. So patients had a medication washout period, and then after that, they received 3 one-hour preparation therapy sessions to build alliance and discuss ways to handle distress should it arise during administration. Participants then had a single 8-hour session in which they received either a 10 milligram or a 25 milligram dose with 2 assisting psychotherapists providing support through the experience. And the comparator arm received, a 1 milligram dose. This is sort of like equivalent to a placebo in this instance, because finding an appropriate placebo is really challenging in psychedelics trials because of the phenomenal subjective experience, especially for some of the more classic psychedelics. And then there were 2 integration therapy sessions following the dosing session. And I think it's really important to just note how complex these treatments are, as both Erin and Chantal have referred to. And this is just depicting patients, and they're really, with psilocybin trials, they're really asked to sort of focus inwards, and will often be there with shades on and listening to music. For this trial, the primary endpoint was a change in the MADRS score, or depression symptoms from baseline. As you can see, there was a significant effect even a day after administration, but the most significant difference was at 3 weeks for the 25 milligram group. Now, what's interesting is that a key secondary endpoint was those who achieved remission. As you can see, at week 3, which is when they had the most significant effect, about 29.1%, or 23 out of 79, achieved remission. And then that went down to 26.6%, or 21 out of 79 participants at 12 weeks. So what that means is, for 56 of the patients who received the 25 milligram dose, did not achieve remission. And so while psilocybin helped some people greatly and helped them achieve remission, what this shows us is that even in the very controlled clinical trials, we know that it doesn't work for everyone, at least not the protocol as it currently is. Maybe some of those folks need a second dose or other doses, or maybe they need a particular type of therapy coupled with a psychedelic. Some of you may have heard of the New England Journal of Medicine article comparing psilocybin to escitalopram or Lexapro, which is a standard antidepressant. This was a study that was double-blind, randomized, controlled trial involving patients with longstanding moderate to severe major depressive disorder. And they compared psilocybin with escitalopram over a 6-week period. Patients were assigned in a 1-to-1 ratio. And here they received 2 separate doses of 25 milligrams of psilocybin 3 weeks apart, plus either 6 weeks of a daily placebo, like a sugar pill, or 2 separate doses of 1 milligram of psilocybin 3 weeks apart, plus 6 weeks of daily oral escitalopram. And what's important is that the dose escalation for the escitalopram group could go up to 20 milligrams at week 3. And this is important because many psychiatrists will tell you kind of need to get to 20 to help most people. So, in a sense, they were only given 3 weeks of a good operative dose. And all of the patients received psychological support, kind of like what was described previously with preparation integration sessions. Their primary endpoint was the QIDS-SR, again, looking at depressive symptoms. And what was interesting is that they did not find a significant difference between the psilocybin and escitalopram groups. And there was a lot of attention around this, because the authors did provide a number of secondary outcomes, which suggested that psilocybin outperformed escitalopram. But the problem was they hadn't corrected for multiple comparisons, which is important, because otherwise it's like going on a fishing expedition and you're bound to find something that hits or sticks. And when they did correct for multiple comparisons, those secondary findings did not show significance. So at least with regards to this study, the jury's still out as to how beneficial psilocybin is. More recently, Franz Wallensweider's group in Switzerland examined the effects, again, of a single moderate dose of psilocybin. So this was more like 15 milligrams as opposed to 25 milligrams. And this was in 52 individuals with MDD, and they looked at it versus placebo. In this case, they used mannitol. The trial was double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, and involved 2 preparation sessions and 3 integration sessions, 2 days, 8 days, and 14 days after the dosing session. They found a significant decrease in symptom severity on both the MADRS and the BDI. And notably, it was at 14 days out. So one of the things you'll note about some of these trials is that they don't go very far out. And so we don't have great long-term data. One thing that was interesting about this trial is they looked at whether or not they found something that hadn't been found in previous trials. So usually in previous trials, the subjective effects are sometimes found to impact therapeutic response or whether or not people got better or seem to be correlated with it. Here, when they looked at it, actually the intensity of the psilocybin-induced subjective effects did not correlate with the reduction in depressive symptomatology. So this question of whether or not one needs a subjective experience remains an open question, and it'll be interesting to see as more research comes out about it. Ayahuasca has received a lot of attention in the press lately, and ayahuasca is a brew consisting of DMT and MAO inhibitors. To date, there aren't any large trials of it. There is one study done by Paulhano Fontes and colleagues in Brazil, and it was a double-blind placebo-controlled study in 29 patients with TRD. And again, they had a medication washout period, and patients either received a liquid dose of ayahuasca or a placebo, which was another bitter tasting brew that they thought would be a close stand-in. And then they received support by 2 therapists who were kind of like next door. So they didn't actively engage in therapy with the therapists, but they were there just in case something happened or patients needed them. They looked at outcome at 7 days, and they found a significant decrease in depression as measured by the HAM-D and the MADRS. But again, there's no data about what happens after day 7. They also looked at response rate and remission. And again, these were significant in the ayahuasca group at day 7, but we don't have any data beyond day 7. The active ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT, and so I'll review 2 studies of related compounds for depression. The first is a phase 2 clinical trial of 8 patients with TRD. They followed a proprietary individualized dosing regimen. So this is an inhaled formulation of 5-MeO-DMT at 6 milligrams, 12 milligrams, and 18 milligrams. And what they tried to do, and this is an open label, they wanted to see to try to get people to achieve peak effect. So these sort of psychedelic subjective experience of that people will report that are profound. And notably, there was no associated therapy. So they just inhaled the substance. The primary endpoint was remission on the MADRS at day 7 after dosing, which is defined as a MADRS score of less than 10. And they had a study that only included 8 patients, but 7 of the 8 patients who achieved peak effect were in remission with the final dose by day 7. There's also been a phase 2A clinical trial of intravenous DMT, which produces about a 20 to 30 minute psychedelic experience with supportive therapy in 34 patients with moderate to severe MDD. Their primary endpoint was the MADRS, and they found a statistically significant difference in MADRS scores between DMT and placebo at 2 weeks following the dose. They showed a rapid onset at 1 week post-dose. And interestingly, at 12 weeks, they found a 57% remission rate with a MADRS score below 10. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, as Aaron mentioned, has been focused on PTSD. And I'd like to briefly go over the results of the first of the two phase 3 trials, because the second one, the results have been analyzed, but they haven't yet published them. So the trial was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, multi-site trial to test the safety and efficacy of MDMA in 90 patients with severe PTSD. So these were folks with CAP scores greater than 35. There were 3 preparatory sessions, 90 minutes each, with 2 therapists. And there were a total of 3 8-hour administration sessions, as well as 3 hours of integration therapy following each dose. Again, these are not quick treatments. They're actually quite involved. The picture here shows a reenactment similar to what Aaron showed earlier. And importantly, the integration therapy afterwards consists of processing the material that came up during the session, although some of that happens during the session, as well as what happens for folks as they come out of the session and are in between sessions. They found a significant reduction in CAPS-5 total severity score from baseline. So you see that here. So especially after 3 sessions. One thing I want to point out is that folks still did really well. These are folks with really high CAPS scores, and they still did pretty well with just psychotherapy alone. So there's no underestimating how much just good treatment can make an impact. Obviously, it was greater with the MDMA along with the therapy. This bar graph shows the percentage of people who are responders or who no longer met CAPS diagnostic criteria and those who met CAPS criteria for remission. So this is the MDMA group and this is the placebo. 67 of the participants in the MDMA group no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD after 3 sessions, compared with 32% of those in the placebo group. Importantly, note that 67% means that, you know, a good third still met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So again, it doesn't help everyone, and that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that individual or with the treatment, but there's a lot we still have to figure out about why some people respond and some people don't, and what we can do to help those who might not be responding to optimize treatment. Additionally, 33% of participants in the MDMA group no longer met criteria for remission or met criteria for remission after 3 sessions, compared with only 5% in the placebo group. So, you know, in sharing these, I just wanted to actually present the actual numbers so that people can get a sense of what the data actually really looks like. And also to drive home the point that there's so much that we still need to learn in order to be able to help the most people, including who is a good fit for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, what kind of therapy, how can we optimize the benefits, and all of that is not going to get in the way of getting treatment to people. I think it's actually going to make it more doable and potentially more accessible. Currently, right now, the amount of effort and the number of resources that have to go into making psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy available is just not scalable. So we're going to have to figure out some other things to think about and be creative. And that's going to require understanding who this works for, how can we get it to work for more people, who does it not work for, who is it really contraindicated for versus who just hasn't been included in the trials thus far. In short, there's a lot of reason to hope, and there's no doubt that this is going to help some people tremendously, but we've got to figure out a lot more to be able to help the most people. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have, from the lay perspective, you know, it's a lot of great information. I noticed a lot of differences in, say, how many doses were administered or maybe the follow-up schedule. And we had a few questions that were sent in ahead of time about those, the post-psychedelic therapy follow-up regimens. But it seems like, and please correct me if I'm wrong or give a better answer, that there's just so much variety right now in the research that we can't necessarily draw a conclusion other than therapy does also help in it, like talk therapy in addition, or psychotherapy in addition to the medicine. Would that be a fair assessment at this point?
Yeah, it can vary completely. I mean, as you saw, even the MAPS protocol is very different from the COMPASS protocol. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those are the best. That's just what was developed with the best information they had at hand to be able to provide this treatment. And I think one other thing that I think is pointed to in terms of the preclinical data is this increased neuroplasticity, so increased capacity for change in the brain. And whenever there's increased capacity for change, it means that we have greater possibility of learning and changing things. And that means that it's a fertile ground for therapy to be more effective as well. So that's why this coupling and this paradigm of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy that Erin referred to may be particularly powerful because of this, things working in concert to, you know, so that opportunity provided by the medication in terms of the neural environment, as well as psychotherapy that can then take advantage of that opportunity to do good things.
I'll just add that, you know, very few of the studies have looked at patients what we call longitudinally, so really far out from when they received the treatment. And so there are a lot of questions about how effective this is in the long term for a patient and whether or not, they'll experience a remission at some point later on. There's also very few studies that have really done like a dose escalation study. So kind of looking at whether or not if you serially increase the dose, do you see a serial increase in the effectiveness or the changes in the patient? And very few studies have really looked at that either. So there's just a lot we don't know. There's more that we don't know, I think, than we do know in terms of the clinical research. And, the more we can kind of not just increase the number of studies, but increase the number of patients in each study, the more we'll actually be able to understand about who these work and under what conditions.
Yeah, let me add too that my colleagues have pointed out that the placebo effect in this research is non-negligible. And so, psychotherapy itself showed decreases in, I think, some of Charman's data that she cited, perhaps Chantal's as well. So I think that's an important thing to note as we move forward with research. This is probably an odd comment coming from an epidemiologist because we're a bunch of research geeks, but numbers geeks. But I want to put a plug in for qualitative research as we move forward with research into these substances. And the reason I say that is because my colleagues and I published the first multi-site randomized controlled trial of stellate ganglion block for treating symptoms of PTSD in service members. We did include a qualitative component in that research that is yet to be published. Numbers are cool, but words tell stories. And as we continue to gather the numbers, that's what's going to convince a lot of scientists. Those numbers are really important, but what's going to be very useful in, I think, convincing policymakers is the stories, the impact that people can share. So just something to consider I think the lack of qualitative data thus far is a real research gap in the research.
And if I could follow up on the long-term follow-up question, unsomewhat intended. And so when it came to I think there's a single long-term follow-up study at 12 months for psilocybin-assisted therapy for depression that found, they just looked at a single clinical trial where they found 58% of folks still remitted from their depression at 12 months. And then when it comes to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, after 1 or 2 months after a single course of treatment, which encompasses 2 or 3 treatments of MDMA, about 50% were no longer diagnosable PTSD, but then there's a 1-year follow-up that found 67% were no longer diagnosable PTSD, and there's statistical significant difference between the post-treatment, like right after post-treatment and 1 year. And so folks actually got better between finishing the treatment and 1 year after treatment. And the longest follow-up for MDMA therapy is 3.8 years. Just a single small clinical trial, and about 77% were no longer diagnosable with PTSD.
Wonderful, thank you. One question that's kind of we had it posed in a few different ways, but relevant to this, both to talking about the research, the individual research studies and all the different variables that go into those. But then is there any sort of coordinated effort to consolidate or tell the big picture story in a way that can be communicated? Are we at that point yet, or what will it take to get there? For anyone.
I think that there's been a number of efforts from the research community to sort of consolidate the evidence in this. The National Academies had a workshop sometime last year. I know that the VA is looking to do a state of the science event later this year. I think those are steps in a positive direction for getting kind of the leadership of various organizations, the scientific community, all sort of on the same page of looking at the potential here. And that gets the attention of policymakers. I think one of our goals as an organization, and we, leading a coalition of other like-minded organizations, is not necessarily to get to the point of approval yet. We want to sort of see how things shake out. I think there's a lot of questions in the FDA space of how they're going to handle the submissions for MAPS and how detailed they're going to be and how they approve it. So are they going to approve this compound under very specific treatment conditions for a very specific protocol? And that will still limit who's actually having access, but really expanding significantly the clinical trials. And I think getting these types of groups like the VA and other members, if we could get DoD leadership on board with those kinds of things as well, that starts to open up kind of the types of populations that can be part of the clinical research. And that really gets us better to the point of understanding who this is going to work for and under what conditions.
I'll add, I feel like consolidation, sorry, Lindsay, consolidation of the research is going to be really challenging because of what Aaron mentioned, and that's that each of these different substances are unique. The analogy that Aaron gave of cancer, I think it was Aaron, is a good one, where you're not diagnosed with cancer, you're diagnosed with a particular type of cancer, and then you are prescribed a relevant treatment regimen for that. So I think it's going to be awfully hard to consolidate the research for that reason.
I would also add it's a bit of a catch-22 for people who are not super familiar with the space, because in order to fund this research, it's very expensive, and you need to have more research to compile it, but you also need to have some sort of proof to get funding for the research, right? And so that's kind of the cycle we've been in, and also why these drugs are still scheduled Schedule 1, because the burden of proof is to get past that they are not addictive and have medical value, but the laws also restrict your ability to research in a lot of ways. But it is happening with some federal policy. There was a bill that was dropped, almost sort of a compassionate use, where, for instance, terminal patients can use experimental drugs. They're trying to get that same sort of dynamic for these, because both MDMA and psilocybin have been declared breakthrough therapies by the FDA. So trying to get those in terms of increased access. And then otherwise, there's state policies. So kind of on a states' rights sort of individual basis, where Oregon, Colorado are doing more advanced ones, where Oregon this year, you'll be able to go to a clinic. But then other states like Connecticut are doing expanded access. So trying to get more patients into the MDMA studies and these other studies. So I think in this case, and similar to what Christine was saying, and with a lot of cases, I think it was the same with stellate ganglion block. Unfortunately, people have to find access to these, and there has to be enough testimonials before anybody is encouraged or funds change. And that's kind of the same sort of thing leading these changes. It's probably going to be more of a bigger voice in terms of veterans that have already found healing through this, or are trying to expand research before we get the significant funding for research.
That's a great segue into the next section that we have here about seeking care and intervention, and about how folks might be able to know which of the several pathways that are out there, either through trying to find a spot in a clinical research study, or pursuing it through spiritual options, or some of the less traditional pathways of seeking care. And so I'd like to offer it to Chantel to discuss seeking care and intervention, and then we'll again have more discussion time for all the experts and questions.
I think from my perspective, if you're looking to kind of go the option of a legitimate clinical trial and participate in clinical research, the best way to sort of know where those clinical trials are happening is to kind of follow what's on clinicaltrials.gov. It's a publicly available website that you can kind of put in your search criteria and see what is out there, and you can kind of contact people and figure out whether or not they're enrolling participants and if you qualify for those clinical studies. In terms of kind of other types of access outside of kind of the clinical trial space, I would say, you know, Jesse, you might be more aware of sort of how to gain access through various nonprofits and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some clinical trials, and then the other ones are observational. And so, I mean, we can go into that a little bit deeper in terms of the dynamics of accessing it and doing it safely. I don't know if you want to save that for later, Lindsay, but I mean, essentially on the research side, a lot of it's going to be clinical, but like everybody said here, those tend to be pretty small numbers and pretty strict criteria. There's other numerous observational studies that are going on, and that kind of follows more of, you know, following certain people in this space on LinkedIn or Instagram, and that's how that gets shared. I don't know any registry for more of the observational. So, and then in terms of other access, it tends to be just, you know, organizations that are really doing harm reduction, like Heroic Hearts, you know, that tends to be more in that. So, you know, there's levels of, you know, in terms of how you access it, in terms of the scale of research and all this of what we know, but then also different organizations that are trying to make it as safe as possible given what we know.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, we will definitely touch more on that a little bit later on. And so right now, I believe that Dr. Wolfgang has maybe a couple more slides on sort of the care seeking and options. I'm going to launch another poll about that as well for our audience to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. And we'll listen to Dr. Wolfgang.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. So just going to touch on a few things that hopefully nicely dovetail from the conversation we just had about different ways in which, or different settings that you can at least in theory receive treatment. And so you can think of there being a spectrum of non-medical to medical settings where you can receive psychedelics. And so there's, of course, recreational use, which of course would be illegal for both civilians and DoD, and regardless of what setting. There's also religious use, which I'll defer to Jesse to expand on shortly. But for civilians, there is a legal pathway for folks to use psychedelics in a very specified and frameworked setting. Whereas when it comes to DoD individuals or active duty service members especially, it's really unclear on whether it would be legal for an active duty service member to use a psychedelic in a religious setting. There's also what's known as the Oregon model, because Oregon recently passed a bill, I believe it was in the last election cycle, where starting this year, January 1st of this year, folks would be able to receive psychedelics in a very specified setting that technically is non-legal, but not technically therapy or under a licensed therapist, but rather is facilitated by an individual who may only have a bachelor's degree and without advanced training, other than having done, I believe, I think like 150 hours of additional training to facilitate providing psychedelics in this hated setting. And so if you're in Oregon as a civilian, there is a legal pathway to receive specifically psilocybin through that model. And when it comes to the DoD, it's also unclear and more likely still illegal to do so. Much in the same way that even though cannabis is legal on a state level, either recreationally or medically, that it'd still be illegal for a active duty service member to receive cannabis through that pathway. And so even though it hasn't been legally tested, it's the same thing for the Oregon model for active duty folks. And then there's also, in terms of the medical realm, there are certain settings, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but maybe Jesse can speak more to this, but going abroad, whether it be to Mexico or to the Caribbean or South America, where there is this legal gray area where potentially it is legal for civilians to receive these psychedelics in a very specified setting outside of the United States, whereas definitely for the DoD or active duty folks, it'd still be illegal because it would not be a legal prescription that would be recognized by the FDA or any entity within the United States. And so even though there's this gray area for civilians, it'd still be illegal for DoD folks. And then, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, there is a legal pathway, certainly for civilians, but also for DoD folks to receive these treatments in a clinical trial setting. But definitely want to caveat this by saying that there are numerous legal caveats to this for DoD folks, and the legal pathway for an active duty service member to receive this treatment in a clinical trial, that legal pathway is very, very narrow, and would certainly not recommend that an active duty service member try to go through that pathway, even though there is this legal pathway, just because there's so many ways in which an active duty service member might not, if you're checking 9 out of 10 boxes, that one last box that you might have overlooked could still put you in legal. And same goes for expanded access with the treatment protocol. And then there's also post-FDA approval treatment, which of course would be legal for civilians and for DoD service members as well in a specified legal pathway. And I just want to also kind of expand on this one last point, which I think when it comes to the big picture, this in my mind is the take-home point on a big picture DoD level. And so there's various scenarios in which the DoD could handle psychedelic-assisted therapies in terms of policy. And so on the left, we see folks who, service members that might be seeking psychedelic-assisted therapy. And if, in scenario one, if there's no access to psychedelic-assisted therapy within the DoD, and there's no access to psychedelic-assisted therapy in the civilian setting, meaning that the DoD has, in this scenario, the DoD has crafted policy to preclude active duty service members from being able to receive treatment either within the DoD or in civilian settings, then what that does is that it potentially incentivizes folks to then seek out these treatments in illicit settings and potentially go untreated as well. And with that, there's of course the potential for increased administrative separations, UCMs, and there's a recreational, pills out there that are adulterated with other substances to include fentanyl. And so, if we're unintentionally incentivizing individuals to seek these treatments out in illicit settings because they're not accessible in legal settings, then that again increases the risk for UCMJ actions and folks potentially dying is the main point. And of course, if folks go untreated, there's a higher potential for medical discharge. And if folks aren't receiving these treatments in a legal setting, to what extent does that decrease retention and return to duty rates? Because if we're at a point where these are FDA approved, and let's say we fast forward 3 years from now, and these are both MDMA and psilocybin potentially are FDA approved, then, and if these are not accessible within the DoD, again, does that actually incentivize active duty folks to get out of the military because it's not accessible? These are because there's going to potentially be such a demand for these treatments, they're not accessible within the DoD. Again, does that incentivize folks to actually get out of them, to get out so they can receive these treatments legally? And there's also scenario 2, where even though these treatments are not accessible within the DoD, that they are still made accessible in the civilian setting. And so with that, with just like we see with residential care, when active duty folks go out to civilian settings, there's much less command oversight of what happens when folks go out to receive care in a civilian setting. What's happening now objectively is that when it comes to access for MDMA therapy right now, is that for 5 to 10 slots for MDMA-assisted therapy expanded access, there's over 1,000 individuals on the wait list just to receive and wanting to receive the treatment. That's happening right now. And so you can imagine how effectively that's as if it's not accessible in the civilian setting. And again, to what extent is that going to incentivize folks to seek treatment in illicit settings or remain untreated and then be medically discharged? And what we're also seeing in the civilian setting is that these treatments are very costly, at least in research settings, $30,000 to $40,000 per patient, which of course just isn't sustainable for any healthcare system. And again, with these long wait lists, very costly treatment, to what extent are folks going to unintentionally overflow into illicit use? And we have the ramifications of that. And lastly, and also just one last point here, I'm aware of at least one active duty individual who spent $20,000 out of pocket just to receive ketamine and SGB treatments because they were just unavailable where he was at. And so I think if we use that as just a case study of just a hint of what we can expect once these treatments are FDA approved, I think we really need to listen to this as a harbinger of what could happen if there is no access within the DoD versus if there is access not only within the DoD and civilian care. Now we have optimal command oversight where we have a granular level of understanding, what's happening to these individuals, where they're being treated, how they're being treated, how they're doing. The wait lists are shorter and we can have a lot more control in terms of costs, which hopefully we can reduce. To what extent can we actually improve retention and improve return to duty rates? And where now we have a setting just like with residential care right now, just in case folks don't know, before I PCS to DC, actually just today, that I was running a residential treatment program down in BAMC, and how residential treatment is playing out in the military is that, we do our best to keep everyone within the DoD, but then there's also a portion of folks that we have to send out to civilian care, and we're okay with that because we do our best to treat everyone within the DoD, but then those extra individuals where we can't handle them, or we don't have enough capacity for them, we overflow them into purchase care or the civilian care. Whereas, I foresee a future where we're using the same model when it comes to psychedelic-assisted therapy, which in my mind is advanced surgery of sorts, psychological surgery. And in this setting, in this case, we can minimize illicit use and we can minimize the number of folks that go untreated. We can minimize medical discharges and the morbidity that comes with illicit use. With that.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point there, and great advocacy. And I'm sure you have a lot of folks nodding their heads along in the audience. And I just wanted to point out from the special ops community perspective, we have a lot of folks with very specific set of skills, and they're highly motivated when they have a mission and a need to fill. And so I think it's even more important for this community that we do work towards finding those pathways for them. So I appreciate your effort in putting all that together and sharing that with us tonight. And Christine, did you have something else that you wanted to jump in on here before we move on to the next section?
I did. Thank you very much. May I share screen for a moment, please? Let's see. Share. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, hopefully you can still see my screen, although I think I may have just revealed my punchline. For those who are on the call, who are not providers or not researchers, for those who may be seeking care, I think it's important to remember that different modalities are going to be effective for different people. One of my colleagues mentioned the prospect of, trying to work toward different types of patients for whom this might be effective, for whom psychedelics might be effective. And I want to bring us back to the SOF core values of honor, courage, excellence, creativity, and respect. And the common denominator there is tenacity. So if one is going to seek out treatment or clinical trials, I know that there's been a question or two in the chat about whether they can avail themselves of research in the VA. I think it's important to display a degree of stick-with-itedness, tenacity, perseverance, and trying to continue to identify not only the research opportunities, but treatment opportunities. Meanwhile, identifying treatment opportunities for more standard research, more standard treatment modalities if one hasn't already. I also would like to, let me stop share screening here for a minute if I can figure out how to do that. Stop share. I also would like to point out that a friend of mine I spoke with who has received treatment with ibogaine and 5-MeO was kind enough to share some of his experience with me, and he made a suggestion that I thought was particularly salient with regard to seeking care and intervention. He noted that after the treatment that he received, he felt like what was missing was an aftercare program. He noted that he had significant changes for the better in his PTS, as well as some TBI symptoms. But he noted that what was necessary is lifelong behavioral change following that treatment. Meditation, sleep, focus on life habits and self-care, reading, tending to spiritual needs if that's relevant for the individual. So it's not necessarily a one and done thing. This friend of mine mentioned very clearly that continued aftercare or some type of continued practice was necessary.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful place to move on and transition a little bit more towards the family and community care and involvement aspect of this, because aftercare is such an important topic for our organization. We really emphasize the role of the family in whole person and whole family health. And so, we are a community, we are a family unit, a community unit, a team unit, and we really need to involve all of the folks on our team in our care. So I'd like to throw it to Jesse now to talk about that, and then we'll have the other experts weigh in as well.
Yeah, and thank you all so much. This is great and very informative to everybody else that's been on this call speaking. I think one of the things that's very clear is there's a lot more to be learned about this, but these substances are, intriguing and bringing new research and really exciting a lot of researchers because of the potential, because as opposed to a lot of medication, they're not just hitting one thing necessarily. Depression, they tend to be much more, there's clinical studies for all sorts of different things, whether it's some sort of mental trauma or even autoimmune diseases or cluster headaches. They're an addiction, and a lot of these researchers haven't seen substances that hit that broad perspective. But it's going to be a paradigm shift, I believe, and this is what we're leading to, in how we treat mental health. As Aaron kind of mentioned, we're sort of switching the script on instead of just getting your prescription, occasional check-ins with the therapist, it's really opening up the power of therapy, the power of connection, the power of really getting deep into some of these issues. And that's what psychedelics tend to unlock. They tend to tear down our walls and allow us to be more emotionally available or see some of these traumas in different ways, which with a trained therapist can really get to much deeper levels at much quicker levels than we've seen with traditional talk therapy. But again, what is also changing is those in-person connections, and that also involves the community afterwards or the aftercare, and as well as the preparation. So for instance, with veterans that go through our program, we do 4 to 6 weeks of preparation just to get them in that right mind, just to get them ready to go for it. So when they're there and it's a challenging experience, they hit the ground running, or they understand how to interpret that challenge, kind of that tenacity sort of dynamic of that's really important. But then the after side too, having multiple months and then also continued check-ins so that they can utilize what was mentioned before, this increased plasticity to really hit the ground running afterwards. This is, if you know anything about working with addiction, it can be very much the same. Some of the tenets of like AA meetings, when you come off a substance, oftentimes you have to change vast dynamics of your life, right? Of sometimes the people you hang out with, sometimes where you hang out with. If you go right back to the bar after treatment, you're going to fall right back into old patterns, and then those will self-reinforce. And so that's really where a lot of this community element comes from. Is, we're communal people, and for quite a while, just in terms of our mental health care, in terms of our care, in terms of our interactions with each other with social media, we're all on Zoom here as opposed to in the same building. We've become more isolated, and I don't think we're getting that same sort of connection. And a lot of these community pieces have dissolved. We see that with the veterans. Modern veterans really don't go to the VFW or the American Legion to the same degree we did before. So we are missing this in person. When we run these retreats, one of the first things that we hear and see that people help them is not even the psychedelic. That does help tremendously, but them being back together in this group, this commonality, or when they're interacting with a therapist or some sort of medical provider, having a veteran liaison there makes a tremendous amount of difference in terms of trust and their acceptance and their vulnerability in this, as long as it's done. The first line of defense in that community is family too. And we have to understand that. I think these treatments are showing that if it's a spouse, oftentimes there's residual PTSD or their own trauma living through these experiences. And if you only helped one part of that formula, then you're still going to have a lot of issues when the person goes home. And so community starts with the family. That's the best line of integration, how you integrate these experiences afterwards. Also having the consideration that, sometimes the children are affected and how to get them proper, talk therapy as well. And then that expands of rebuilding these in-person connections. I think us as veterans are specifically sensitive to having that accountability unit, because we see this with a lot of the people coming out, and this was mentioned before, of how do you get to PTSD? It's not just this one level. We saw the same sort of thing of, you can cure somebody of PTSD or depression, but they still might be miserable. Their life still might be a mess, right? They could still be in debt, or they can still be going through a divorce, and they're going to be miserable even if they don't rate on the PTSD scale. But then there also could be so many other factors of going from that job of significance to a corporate job where you feel like your day-to-day input is not having any impact, where before you're at the tip of the spear, you're interacting with it. The other sense is that isolation. Isolation is so huge, and I don't think it's discussed enough in terms of therapy, in terms of what veterans are going through, which all just feeds on each other. They augment each other. And then lastly, sort of that sense of purpose, or for some people it's spirituality, for some people it's belonging, but doing something of significance. And so you see a lot of veterans going into nonprofits or going into serving others. When we have veterans that have significant healing, almost the first thing they say is like, how can I help? Like, how can I bring this to other people? Which is a beautiful dynamic of this group. And we can really, I think, utilize that in the future. But it's also a point of note of we are people of service. And if we don't have that in our day-to-day life, maybe there's something missing. Just as for a lot of us, sometimes we need the mental stimulation, sometimes we need the creative stimulation. We all need some sort of physical stimulation exercise. So it's a component dynamic, holistic for that term has a lot of baggage, but that there is a baseline definition of it that makes sense here. And so those are the things that we really need to consider when we transform our view of mental health. It's not just going to the doctor, checking in, getting a medication, maybe for some people for sure, but I would like to see a more expanded access, more touch points, more peer support, more support within the community, accountability. All these things are so important to make this effective. And I do think, as many others said, these are just tools and we need more tools, but we're also finally starting to rethink a lot of these systems. And there's a lot of potential, because I think what's absolutely abundantly clear is what we are doing right now, the only options that are available right now are just not working for enough people. They're working for some, but there's a huge gap of people that desperately need this. And I'm sure a lot of you know, there's a lot of people that just don't have the luxury of time to wait 10 years, 15 years, 20 years for drug developments to happen. So we need to start figuring this stuff out right now. And what can we do in the meantime? What's allowable, what's ethical, what's within our risk tolerance? Because even with MDMA possibly being next year, I promise you it's going to take a while to permeate through VA culture and get the proper amount of people trained. So there are some means and access that we can go into. Yeah, I mean, the community element, the accountability, it's such a huge element that I don't see talked about enough when we're thinking about the bigger picture of mental health.
I agree with that, Jesse, and I think it's important to note, one of the things that you mentioned and somebody in the chat mentioned as well, this notion of the need for the support system, and the community can be that sort of a support system, be it the SOF community, the neighborhood community, the family community, or the culture, as it were. And one of the things that my friend who received treatment shared with me that I really appreciated, that your comment, Jesse, got me thinking about your comment about having a veteran liaison, was that he said, and this is a quote, "Dudes are scared to death of things like LSD flashbacks, psychosis, and some of those things." And he noted that a lot of these substances have been in use for centuries by different cultures. And he pointed out that this should be viewed as medicine, not recreation. There's a tremendous difference here. And, people are willing to self-medicate with prescription medications, drinking, recreational drugs, but they're afraid of psychedelics. And to some extent, that's probably due to messaging that the government has and other entities have put out. The drugs and the meds and the alcohol are somewhat known entities, and they're kind of normalized, whereas psychedelics aren't. So I'm grateful to that friend of mine for sharing that information.
I just wanted to say one thing about what Jesse spoke to, which is really important. And I think a lot of the elements that he spoke to are just as important for the current treatments we have available, right? So how many people who get meds actually get access to good therapy at the same time, even though we know the research shows that people who both get meds and therapy do better? The systems of care that are in place are not necessarily what even some of us psychiatrists would want for our patients. I know my patients do better when they're getting combined medication and therapy. Can all my patients get therapy? No, especially after the pandemic, where there is an incredible shortage. And there's also been attrition of people in the mental health care field. I think also this aspect of community and who are people, where do people exist in, is vital, whether you're talking about psychedelics or therapy, or, if somebody doesn't have a job and can't feed themselves, talking about, you've got to have basic essentials covered. And there's no way to lift people out and make their mental health that much better without addressing some of those basic essential concerns. And that's true not just within psychedelics, it's also true just in general to how we, in terms of how we provide care to people. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to move towards, or actually move back to, because, originally, psychiatric care was much more holistic. I mean, the biopsychosocial model has been around far longer than, the second wave of psychedelics research. But we pay lip service to it instead of seeing it happen in reality. But there was a time when even people with psychotic disorders had jobs, farming on the, at the psychiatric hospital and stuff. There was a place for people to be protected and supported, even with the most severe illness. And we have sort of moved away from that. And that's to the detriment of people who suffer from mental illness, and really all of us, because no family goes untouched. So, when we think about what would be good for not just somebody with mental illness, but really for mental wellness and health, like if we think about that, then all of these things are really important. The social aspect is important for all of us, that aspect of community. And the reality is, even before COVID-19, loneliness was that we were talking about pandemic levels of loneliness. And that has to do with how we approach family and community. Suddenly people were at home. One of the good things about the pandemic is people didn't have commutes, and suddenly they were home for dinner with their families, and that made a big difference for a lot of people that I know in terms of how they could connect to their kids and understand their kids, despite all the stresses that were going on. And what would be great is if we take some of those lessons and think about implementing them now, because we can't just think about it in terms of psychedelic therapies. And as Jesse mentioned, some of and Aaron mentioned, some of these things are 10 years down the line, so we've got to improve some of these things for folks now, because those will help even with the current treatments that are available.
Adding on to what you guys are talking about, and the meaning of connection and community and how it plays in with psychedelic therapy, but mental health in general, and loneliness throughout the public. Are you seeing things, strategies that are particularly effective, Jesse, and what you guys are doing, but that we have known about for so long, Charmin and everyone on here, for mental health and the biopsychosocial model, ways that you would double down for everyone? Because often we'll hear people are, doing research for when they retire, so that if they want to do psychedelics, it's an option and stuff like that, which says there's problems brewing and there are ways to get upstream. So if we're going to get upstream, there's surely a mirroring happening. Like, it's effective with treatment, but if we can get upstream and start those things now, what are the first strategies you would give people for building community inside and outside their family, among fellow service members, veterans, and then at home?
I think everybody has to take a pretty it's hard, but you have to it's hard, especially when you're in the trauma state, right? Like, the last thing you want to do is or you might not even have the ability. The interesting thing we're seeing about psychedelics is, one, they have a very long tradition. It's not apples to apples comparison to a brand new chemical that's going through the FDA. There's long historical uses, a relatively low risk from evolution through the tribes that use it, and those are always communal access. Whether it's a spiritual sort of ceremony or for mental health, or sometimes physical health even. It's always been that, or other ceremonies that are not psychedelic based. And so this is, I think, bringing in this new dynamic. I think in terms of one of the interesting things I'm following in terms of scalability, in terms of possible effectiveness, whether or not from placebo or not, but there's group therapy dynamics where we're starting to see more test cases of utilizing some of these treatments within a group setting. Might have some individual settings, but they're all going through it together, and they're integrating together with their own individual sessions. And so one, just really building that bond, or reintroducing them to that bond, to when they become mutually accountable, mutually supportive, and hopefully it's localized so they can continue that post the psychedelics. I think that could potentially be hugely effective on many different levels. And I think the rest of it, again, I think it's tapping in, it's the resources available. I think it's tapping into that thing of service. There's so many organizations and veterans that are out there just wanting to help each other. And I think having community systems with funding where they can get together, not just at a, smoky bar and talk drunk war stories, but there might be some other things that are appealing to veterans, whatever, like saunas or float tanks or other just video game consoles where there's a health component to it too, for the families as well. Working with systems that are already in place, or VFWs are already in place, and revamping them to that, I think would be a good first step.
I will just add that, I think one thing that everybody who sort of gets into this needs to understand is that it takes a lot of work, and it's a lifelong process of healing, for lack of a better word. I mean, I'm 20 years out from a PTSD diagnosis. I in no way consider cure in my vocabulary. I just don't think cure is really a reality for PTSD. I think you maybe don't meet diagnostic criteria and you go through the healing process, but it's a constant challenge of sort of checking in with yourself, setting good boundaries, thinking holistically about, ensuring that you kind of think about your nutrition, your exercise, and all of those kinds of things. And you just continuously do the work to make sure, you're kind of on the path that you want to stay on. And I think we can't ever really look to any certain treatment as a silver bullet, because I just don't think that any of them are ever going to be that for anybody. It's always going to involve a component of work.
That's a great point. And I think that, this population definitely is no stranger to hard work and putting in the effort. But I do think, from the discussion we just had, sometimes there can be this desire to, find the magic bullet from the buddy network. Hey, this one thing worked for me. And so I really appreciate everybody here tonight, really contributing to that understanding of this whole topic of psychedelic medicine as a set of tools within a larger toolkit that still has a lot of research that needs to be done to fully understand it. But in the meantime, there are some safer ways to pursue potentially getting involved with this type of therapy. So I'm going to throw one more poll question up for our audience. But what I'd really like to do is make sure that we have time in case there's anybody in the audience who wanted to ask a question while we have our experts here. So I know we've had some great discussion in the chat, but if there's anyone who wanted to ask a question live, this would definitely be the time to do that. You can unmute your microphone or raise your virtual hand. But then other than that, one thing that would also be helpful, I think, for folks who are interested in seeking this type of therapy is just some maybe red flags or even just caution flags to look out for when you're maybe hearing from a buddy something that they went and did maybe out of the country, or if somebody says sign up for this clinical trial or go to this clinic, what are the good ways that folks can actually safely pursue this?
What I'll say is that there's just so much we still just don't know. There's a lot more that we don't even know that we don't know at this point, and which is why more research is so critical for these substances and for different populations. And yeah, so that's what I would add to that. And there's certain diagnoses like borderline personality disorder that have been excluded in certain clinical trials, and doesn't necessarily mean for sure that these treatments don't work for those individuals, but because they haven't been studied, we simply don't know. Other diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder also often have been excluded, and we just simply don't know. And so that's my plug for the point that there's a lot we don't know and more research is needed.
I think a red flag for me would be an organization or a website or a clinic that's overly markety, overly sells itself, or overly sells the claims about whatever the treatment may be. I think that would be a huge red flag.
Yeah, if I could piggyback off of that, Caro, that's such a great point, because even though, for example, with MDMA therapy, 2/3 of folks are no longer diagnosable after treatment, it also means 1/3 of folks were still diagnosable after treatment, and the same goes with psilocybin-assisted therapy and all these other treatments. That the point being that these are not panaceas and these are not cures, and so any organization or website or friend that or even, a scientist, clinician, whoever, anyone that's purporting that this is going to cure your diagnosis, that this is going to wipe everything away, that this is the end all be all, that's a huge red flag, because again, it isn't about the substance, it's about the therapy, and the medication is there to enhance the therapy. And so without the therapy, and you're simply taking a substance that may or may not be helping you anyway. And so again, these are not panaceas, these are not cures, and anyone purporting that is lying to you.
Yeah, from our standpoint, again, I'm kind of in a different space than a lot of the clinicians and researchers, understandably, and we kind of view ourselves in almost a harm reduction triage sort of dynamic, where, as Aaron mentioned, we have ourselves over 1,500 people on our wait list. So it's a lot of these people have been in therapy for quite a while, and really, in a lot of cases, don't seem to have that luxury of time that I mentioned before. And so if they've tried everything else, from our standpoint, if they are looking to go to other spots or centers, what we can do is at least make sure that that pathway is fully supported, and that they're linking up to some of these clinics or retreats. And, it might seem scary of going to these retreats and stuff, but a lot of them have very long histories and do things quite professionally. So I wouldn't, make that just be the line in the sand if this is something that from your own risk assessment is there. Again, in the US and domestically, realistically, it's going to take quite a while for this to take hold. So red flags on yourself: major health concerns, physical health, major mental health considerations. Generally speaking, a lot of medications like SSRIs are contraindications, so those can be dangerous as far as we know right now. A lot of psychedelics. So from yourself on the counter, if you're relatively healthy physically and mentally, things like psilocybin have a very low risk potential from a physical standpoint. For programs, you want to make sure, like I said, with what we do, is preparation. Like you're not just giving your credit card number and going there and then good luck. There should be build up. A lot of them have diets. A lot of them have mental health practices, intentions leading into it. How they run the retreat centers, if they're taking it seriously. Whether it's the retreat or clinic, a lot of them will have therapist supervision over there while doing this. And then again, do they have some sort of integration? Are they prepping you for the time home? Are they actually seem to be concerned more with you getting better versus how much you're paying them? So those are the things to look into. And real quick, like I said, in Oregon, this is starting to be legal on a statewide basis. Aaron mentioned that. There are, like I said, viable retreats that have long history, but again, you have to use your own risk tolerance with that. Do your due diligence, look into it, ask around, do all that kind of stuff if you are going to do it. All of this is serious work, right? This is mental health consideration. You want to make sure you're in the best hands. And was brought up. There are certain cases within the US, like the statewide, where it's either increased access or local. Those are very new right now. And so we're starting to figure out what psychedelics look like in the US. There are some cases of churches, but it's a very vague sort of thing. I'd say that's kind of in a little bit more of a darker gray in terms of the scales of gray of this work. There are 3 churches, UDV, Santo Daime, and the Native American Church, that actually got Supreme Court ability to practice in the USA through their sacraments. But those are the other cases. All the other churches that are popping up out there are following those precedents. So there is legal precedent of religious use of these as sacraments, but the DEA has not been responding to those applications because it's dragging their feet. It should respond to them, but it just hasn't done it. So they're following precedent, but they haven't been officiated by the DEA. So it's one of those territories. And again, with extra caution, I'd say do your due diligence there, because especially overseas where it is legal, like in Mexico, Peru, the countries are allowed to operate. So you can have a little bit more visibility on what's going on. So just do your due diligence, look into it, and educate yourself. But there are ways, if you are comfortable with that you can really maximize the safety of these treatments.
I think for folks who are veterans or have civilian care as well, I think it's important to realize that more and more psychiatrists are recognizing the importance of harm reduction, are willing to have an open conversation about what are the things that we would worry about, and how to best support you if you do choose to go through with something like this. My specialty is bipolar disorder, and so I'll tell them that patients with bipolar disorder haven't been run it, so that they can make a risk benefit assessment. We'll never recommend it because we can't and shouldn't, but we recognize that people might seek the care, and at the end of the day, we want to take care of our patients, and so we'll sort of lay out the reasons for caution, whether that's their own personal history or their family history, and then talk about what to do if they choose to go out there, because we fully recognize people make their own decisions, and we want to be able to support them. That doesn't stop our support of them when they get back.
Wonderful, thank you. Were there any other comments from the rest of the panelists before we shift to wrapping it up for the evening? Any other questions? We had one about a specific, any studies within the intelligence community, and I would venture to say that from some of the discussion earlier in the chat that it's more about maybe locally where you are with respect to, say, VA studies that are happening. It just depends on where the facility that the study is happening in is located. But it doesn't seem like the state of the research is looking at specific populations, maybe within career fields. Would that be a correct assessment on that one?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. But I appreciate everybody who has been active in the chat, and of course all of our panelists. And right now, I would like to turn things over to the MSOFC Executive Director, Kaylee Lehman, to give our closing comments.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight, especially our expert panel, Erin, Chantel, Charmin, Christine, and Jesse. You guys bring together diverse views from across the community, the research areas, and have done such a beautiful job bringing the best of the research and the information and the advice that you can give everyone, from the community members to the experts and active duty personnel who've been on tonight. So thank you for being part. Thank you for sending your questions in advance so we can build it into the presentation. And thank you for offering additional thoughts and questions in the chat. There's been really great discussion here. Don't let it stop with the chat and your registered questions. If you leave, or even in a month, when you see the recorded video that comes to your email or you find on the blog or on social media, send questions to our team, home@msofc.org. We will always reach back to the experts, and we will connect you with the resources and information you ask. It is our goal to be as collaborative and transparent, answering all questions for all stakeholders, providers, military leaders, and our community, the spouses to our left and right, their husbands, the veterans in the community. So don't be shy in your questions and your seek for resources. We invite your feedback tonight. So you'll see a survey in the box, what we can do to improve these deep dives and the way we follow them up with information and education that we make available to you. Also, mark your calendars for the next SOF team room. The deep dives follow every SOF team room by about a month, and the next one is on transition. It'll happen June 20th in collaboration with Global SOF Foundation. So if you watch, you'll start seeing information come out about that. We're starting to put the lineup together now. The follow on that one will be specific to the medical board process and health after service and seeking care. So any thoughts you have about that, we will make sure to build into the team room. So reach out to our team with your questions and thoughts, and otherwise have a great night. We hope you learned something tonight and are looking for the information to share with your network.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.